The indigenous people of T are clearly related to the indigenous people of A, but were separated from them when the land bridge between Australia and Tasmania disappeared approximately 10,000 years ago. So I stopped there. That's 4 lines. That's a lot going on. And I was like, okay, so we know these two people were related, but they were separated whenever this bridge disappeared. Okay, cool. 2,000 years after the disappearance of the land bridge, however, there were major differences between the culture and technology of the indigenous T's and the indigenous A's. The indigenous T's, unlike their A relatives, had no domestic dogs, fishing nets, polished stone tools, or hunting implements like the boomerang and the spear thrower. All right, so then we go on to say, so like it's been 2,000 years since the bridge disappeared, and it gives us differences between these two cultures. And so whenever it says like the T's, unlike the A relatives, did not have these things, I like to make that positive in my own head. You don't have to, but I like to say, so the Australians had these things and the T's did not. It's just, I like to think about things positively so I don't get confused with double negatives. So each of the following, if true, would contribute to an explanation of the differences described above, except. Amani, did you catch the except on this when you did this one?
Yes, I still got it wrong, but
okay. I didn't know, because sometimes when people do the same question type over and over, they stop reading the question stem because they know it's a
I caught myself doing that last night.
So we haven't really talked about accept questions yet, about specific strategy, but how accept questions are one of the questions I do something personally a little fancy on is I actually do highlight the accept when I'm taking the test on the Law Hub. And I actually write down A, B, C, D, E on my scrap paper. And I go through and I ask myself, like, if this, like for this one, which of the following, if true, would contribute to an explanation? And so if it does, I put a check mark next to that answer, because what happens is when I get halfway through these answer choices, I forget that it's an accept question. And so I'm like, oh, that's a paradox. I'm doing it. So the reason that I take like an extra 15 seconds to write it down is because if I have 4 check marks, I don't forget I'm less likely to forget what I'm doing. And there's only like 1, maybe 2 on a test. So it's not like it's going to like take that much extra time. But how we want to go through these is, for starters, if this was a paradox question, we want to make a prediction of like why we think there are these differences. And so let's start there. So everyone throw out what you think is your prediction of like, what would be an explanation of why the A's had these things and the T's did not?
Maybe
because the A's were more evolved, or they
more evolved. Yeah. What else do you think? What do you think, Elka?
I was gonna say maybe they had what's it called, exposure to other cultures.
Oh, I like that. Like someone maybe brought ideas that had already been established. I like that. Maybe the A's were more carnivorous, where the T's were just vegetarian, so they had no reason for spear throwers and fishing nets. I mean, that's a terrible like prediction, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if my predictions make sense completely, as long as I'm focusing on what those 2 facts are and what potentially could explain it. And so now that this is an accept question, we, instead of looking for the unicorn, we want to, if it works, we cross it off, right? So if it could be an explanation, we cross it off. So we're not looking for the right answer at first. We're looking for the 4 wrong answers. Does that make sense? This is definitely more important on like a strengthen or weaken question, where I go through, if it's like a strengthen accept, I'm like, does this strengthen it? Yes, cross it off. Does it strengthen? Yes, cross it off. Because what happens is sometimes the correct answer, the accept, doesn't necessarily weaken it. It just does nothing. And so we can talk more about that later, but like just so the accept, I'm like, if it's a paradox, cross it off. And so go ahead and take a minute and read through these and put your answer in the chat. Oh, sorry. And here's my dog. She's like, Mom, pay attention to me. And so A says, after the disappearance of the land bridge, the Tasmanians simply abandoned certain practices and technologies that they had originally shared with their Australian relatives. Yeah, that would make sense, because maybe and how does this work? Because if this is saying that they have the same things and then they just stopped using them. I don't think that probably would happen in real life, but if it were true, it would explain it. So we can cross A off. All right, so let's go down to E. E says, although the technological and cultural innovations were developed in Australia more than 10,000 years ago, they were developed by groups in Northern Australia with whom the Tasmanians had no contact prior to the disappearance of the land bridge. This was this shows why they were different, right? Because they were in one area where there was no overlap. So this kind of helps explain it. So we can cross E off. All right, D says, indigenous people of Australia developed hunting implements like the boomerang and the spear thrower after the disappearance of the land bridge. Yeah, so this is saying that they just developed them after they were already separated. Excellent. Okay, so the answers that we had narrowed it down to were B and C. So I want everybody to go ahead and either affirm their answer and send the same answer they had before or change their answer. So we're looking for the one that doesn't explain the difference. So what were your thoughts, Amani?
Yes. So, well, I did this question last night, and I was down to B and C. I selected B, but
B as in
now
boy?
that yes, B as in boy.
Okay, so explain to us why B is wrong.
Because the more than 10,000 years ago. Yes, it says 10,000 years ago when they disappeared approximately, but they're saying now 2,000 years after their disappearance. That's when these innovations came about. So that's why I think C is correct, because they have more recently than 10,000 years ago. I hope, unless I mixed it up.
I'm sorry, are you saying B or C as in cat is the correct answer?
I'm saying, well, then if that's the case, it would be B.
I think you flipped up the accept. Like, I think because you just explained it for the right reason, but then you chose the wrong answer.
Yeah, okay, that's what I see.
That makes sense. No, it happens to the best of us, let me tell you. Or what happens is you narrow it down between two, and then you go back and you're debating, and you're like, oh, for example, this one, C works. Oh, that solves the paradox. I'm going to pick C and move on, and you forget it's the accept. Like, because does that make, yeah. That's why I read it. So if we go back to this and look at it, so let's look at C as in cat. It says, technological innovations such as fishing nets, polished stone tools, and so on were imported to Australia explorers more recently than 10. So this is since the bridges disappeared. This was literally Elka's prediction. So that had to feel good when you got that correct. And then D says devices such as the spear thrower and the boomerang were developed. Yeah, this makes no sense. This is actually like the complete opposite. Because if the T's developed this more, like, why don't they have it now if they developed it more than 10,000 years ago? And so that's why B is going to be our answer here. Does that make sense, everybody?
That makes sense. I just